How many trans people have to be murdered before society begins taking things seriously? Will it ever? Or are we truly condemned? These are the questions I found myself asking over and over again in the 5 months it has taken me to make this video, going through multiple breakdowns and periods of what I can only describe as a white-hot rage. The sort which, when left alone with, has you wondering, how many of the people responsible could I personally get to in order to give them a physical copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Oh, where do you think I was going with that? But yes, contrary to what many people seem to believe, prisoners are people and thus still have human rights. That is what makes it so horrific that we have a system in the UK which not only allows them to die, but will actually torture them to death, especially if they're marginalised, as illustrated very clearly by the state-sanctioned murder of trans man Toni Asik. Yet, as I quickly discovered, Toni was not their first victim, nor their last, as we'll see today. Sodexo and HMP Bronzefield are still trying to drive trans mask folk into taking their own lives, including people who have not faced trial yet. But first, a quick content warning for the following. Transmisia, ableism, racism, genocide, Israel, state violence, sexual assault, medical violence, infant death, and suicide. If our work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so that we can keep the channel running. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. I'd also just like to take this time to remind our viewers that statements made throughout our videos are the opinions of myself, the host, based on the evidence I have available to me. They are not and should not be taken as unquestionable fact, which is why we reference everything, because we're fallible. Thus we strive to give you, the viewer, the ability to check all evidence yourself in order to make up your own mind, which is what the reference numbers in the top left corner are for, being numbers that match up with the reference list found in the transcript linked down below. As such, we encourage all viewers to do their own research to reach an informed conclusion about the topic. Hi there, my name's Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and we need to talk about Toni Asik, a trans man who was tortured to death inside a UK prison, with staff weaponising his trans status to effectively bait him into taking his own life before tormenting his friends after said death. 2 trans mask folk housed in the same prison who have yet to face trial were even punished for hugging one another after Toni's murder. These are facts which have largely been ignored by the mainstream press, with the only article that covers said murder at the time whilst acknowledging Toni's trans status being The View magazine, which is a small magazine written by prisoners themselves. This is something made all the more worrying when we acknowledge that not only are there other trans men in the same prison, but one had already tried to take his own life within days of Toni's murder. It's also important to note that this story quickly became about so much more, with Sodexo, the corporation contracted for Toni's torture and subsequent death, having a decade-long history of extreme violence against inmates and is now weaponising the UK's anti-protest laws to fill its cells with those objecting to the genocide of the Palestinian people. But it's not just inmates who have been murdered by said corporation. Sodexo is known worldwide for murdering newborns via neglect of care, and yet, in spite of that, has still been held up as one of the world's most ethical companies whilst having the full support of the gender-critical movement. Facts that seem so cartoonishly evil that they must be fiction, except they're not. But narrowing things back down to Toni Asik, his murder was brought to my attention via a post published by Bashback on the 7th of August, which read as, quote, "On the week of 28th July 2025, a trans man held at HMP Bronzefield died after weeks of abuse, misgendering, and dead naming. He is one or 2 people murdered by the Sodexo-run institution this week. The prison has responded with lockdowns. Call HMP Bronzefield. No justice, no peace." End quote. This was then followed the very next day by a second post, this time giving us Toni's name, declaring boldly that, quote, "His name was Toni Asik. He was murdered by Sodexo and the state. Say his name. Fight back." End quote. The first thing I did was check for additional information, which led me to the prison obituary published by the Prisons and Probation's Ombudsman, or PPO. The PPO is a public body appointed by the Secretary of State for Justice, which is intended to investigate complaints by prisoners, deaths of prisoners, and deaths of recently released prisoners. And sure enough, there was an entry for Toni, independently confirming his name, the prison he was incarcerated in, and the date of death. I also came across an article published by the View magazine, a UK-based outlet founded by incarcerated women to give themselves a voice, including the many women held at HMP Bronzefield. Though I need to be clear, they don't just talk about women's rights in relation to prison, but rather any issue which they find important, from Israel's ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people to the plight of their trans inmates, including Toni. And the article lays out in no unclear terms what happened, informing us that, quote, 25-year-old Toni Asik, a trans man, tragically died while in the care of Sodexo Limited, the private company running HMP Bronzefield. Toni was consistently misgendered and mistreated by staff at the prison. Despite repeatedly disclosing that he was suicidal, he was placed in the prison's healthcare unit, a wing known for housing women with severe mental health issues, rather than being given appropriate support. End quote. This is something that Ali Asik, Toni's father, would later go on to corroborate in an interview with the View magazine, noting how said staff would target Toni, specifically in the shower, in an attempt to isolate Toni or perhaps even turn his fellow inmates against him, which, thankfully, they failed in doing. By Ali's recollection, the vast majority of the women at HMP Bronzefield supported Toni as a man. Another thing the interview with Ali tells us is that Toni was medicated for schizophrenia, or at least he was, until staff at HMP Bronzefield began denying him his medications without explanation, whilst locking him alone inside a cell for 2 to 3 days every weekend due to staff shortages. So we have the second-hand testimony of Toni's dad and witnesses inside the prison itself confirming that Toni was harassed over his gender, denied essential medication, and that, in spite of repeatedly disclosing that he was feeling suicidal as a result, no action was taken against those responsible. Instead, Toni was treated as the problem, punished and isolated from everyone who could give him what little support he was holding onto. Toni's death wasn't an accident, but rather the entirely foreseeable consequences of the decisions made by the staff at HMP Bronzefield. Yet it gets even worse, with the original View article then going on to let us know that, before his body was even cold, the very same staff responsible for his murder began to deliberately taunt other inmates, adding that, quote, Toni's friends, still grieving, were further traumatized when a prison officer, identified as Officer Perry on House Block 2, was heard loudly singing Beautiful Girls with the lyrics, You Make Me Suicidal, in a way that was cruel and triggering. This kind of behavior demands immediate investigation for misconduct in public office. End quote. So not just mocking a recent suicide, but further misgendering and dehumanizing Toni, continuing the very violence which caused him to take his own life. And yet, in spite of this abject cruelty, the tone among staff was celebratory, with the article telling us that, quote, following Toni's death, Bronsefield's deputy director Angie Dench, a former police officer, and head of residential Christy Morrison delivered self-congratulatory speeches to staff praising their response. This performance stands in stark contrast to the brutal reality experienced by those inside. End quote. Suffice to say, there is zero trust in the system among Toni's friends on the inside, with the article concluding that, quote, The supposed investigation by the PPO, led by Adrian Usher, offers little hope. Prisoners' complaints often don't even reach the right facility, and the system lacks the independence or competence to hold anyone truly accountable." End quote. Ali also told The View that he wouldn't be surprised if the documents supplied at the hearing, scheduled for February 2026, were altered to hide certain details, such as the denial of Toni's medications. And from what we've seen in the months since, yeah, everyone's right to be skeptical, which is why this topic is still so important. We need as many eyes on this hearing as possible. This case reminds me of one I covered a decade ago, that of Vicky Thompson. Vicky was a trans woman who had grown up in and out of care her entire life, lacked every available opportunity, and, as a result, turned to shoplifting to make ends meet. She was put on probation, but without support, that merely acted as a delay before she was sent to prison. A male prison, in spite of her crime being non-violent in nature. It should be noted this wasn't her first time in a male prison, with her having been raped repeatedly the last time she was incarcerated. As other inmates began making threats against her, talking about visiting her in her cell, Vicky told staff that if she was kept there, she'd leave in a box. The prison staff, having normalized rape as an extension of the prison system, their workplace, chose to do nothing to protect her. Vicky was found hanging in her cell on the 13th of November, killed by the state's inaction, condemned to death for shoplifting as a trans woman. This is an example of the two-tier system for trans people in the UK when it comes to law, how even petty crimes often come with the death penalty, or worse. And here we see something very similar having been done to a trans man, only not by his fellow inmates enabled by prison staff, but by the prison staff themselves. That's how normalized violence against trans people is in the UK, including trans men. That staff not only did this, but felt secure enough in their untouchability that they set out to torment Toni's friends during the period immediately after his death, a period that would normally bring with it heightened scrutiny. This has had entirely predictable results. As later revealed by Bashback, a second unnamed trans man threw himself over a railing to try and take his own life less than a week after Toni's murder. Sodexo responded with lockdowns and other violence intended to stop the news reaching the press, which, sadly, seems to have succeeded. It is a stark reminder that the state can and does target trans men, and that they cover it up. It's one worth keeping in mind the next time you assume that nothing bad ever happens to trans men. This is what they mean by erasure. Having experience of their suffering, even their very existence, violently stamped out so that no one will be there to advocate for them. It's no surprise then that the little attention Toni's case has received has been absolutely facile. Toni's death did receive some attention, but only as one or two deaths which occurred within 24 hours of each other. The other victim was Tracy Dyke, a cis woman, as far as we know, who was found unresponsive in House Block 1, a detox unit. That's 2 deaths, 1 prison, less than 24 hours. Sadly, this allowed the papers to package the deaths up, letting them withhold all details of Toni's identity and death without making that apparent. Starting with the Mirror, it failed to acknowledge Toni's name or trans status, degendering him entirely. Meanwhile, the Metro misgendered Toni in the article, referring to him as a woman, whilst the Sun and Daily Mail misgendered Toni in their headlines. None of these papers clarify that he's a trans man at any point, or even imply it, let alone correctly identifying him as a trans man. It's worth noting that the View magazine article discussing Toni's death and its causes was published on the 31st of July, whilst all 4 of these mainstream articles weren't published until the 4th of August. It is also important to note that not a single mainstream article has been updated as of the 28th of November, a quarter of a year later. I can therefore only assume this to be a deliberate attempt to erase Toni's gender, and, by extension, his humanity. This is the papers reinforcing state violence, not only by continuing the misgendering of Toni, but by supporting said state in erasing their violence against trans men. Which brings us to the gender-critical fascists and their attempt to downplay the violence Toni was made to suffer, along with that of Tracy Dyke and the voices of the women in Bronzefield who has spoken out against said violence. Trans Crime UK is your usual neo-Nazi website doing a hate speech routine, grabbing headlines or cases involving a trans culprit before putting them in one place in order to make it look like there's a trans crime epidemic in the UK, in spite of what the statistics tell us. This is nothing more than a fear campaign intended to other trans people as inherently criminal, just like they've historically done with black people, feminists, gay people, and the Roma, to name a few popular targets. They of course opened a page on Toni Asik sometime in mid-August in which they referred to Toni as, quote, a 25-year-old female who reportedly identified as a transgender man, end quote. Again, doubling down on the very violence which drove Toni to suicide, declaring their full support for said state violence. And yet, as if that wasn't fucked up enough, they ridiculed human rights groups who tried to restore some of Toni's humanity by fighting the erasure of his identity and murder, with Trans Crime UK presenting what they asserted was a, quote, example of trans activist hyperbole claiming Asik was murdered by the state, end quote, in which they shared a tweet by Stats for Lefties, which acknowledged the fact that, quote, one of the people murdered by Sodexo-run HMP Bronzefield was a trans man, not a woman. His name was Toni Asik. Say his name. The private prison system and the state murdered him and then ran to the press to misgender him in death. Absolute scum who have blood on their hands. End quote. That's what Trans Crime UK are ridiculing here. Doing the job of covering for the state that murdered Toni. Which is interesting, considering that gender-critical fascists claim to protect women and also claim that trans men are really women, yet they mock and deny violence against said women. Trans Crime UK also acknowledges that Tracy Dyke also died, yet they act like it is nothing. And yet, despite of going out of the way to abandon Toni, gender-critical fascists still forcibly claim him as a female who reportedly identified as a transgender man. In doing so, they revealed a system where they misgender trans men as women, harass anyone else who doesn't misgender them as such, and yet deny them any and all protections that they extend to women. They also completely erase the autonomy of the cis women writing for the View magazine. You know, the people who first ran the headline, Sodexo Limited, in the business of killing people. A headline written weeks before Stats for Lefties made their post echoing said sentiment. But they still pretend like this is all trans activist hyperbole. Which is an interesting take on female empowerment. You think that a self-declared feminist movement, or even one that pretended to care about women's safety and autonomy might, you know, be more concerned about the treatment and voices of the cis women at HMP Bronzefield? But hey, what the fuck do I know? I'm just a goddamn trans activist. The thing is, had they actually done that, they might have discovered just how deep the rock goes. For while Sodexo was declared by Ethisphere to be one of the world's most ethical companies in both 2024 and 2025, the reality is said company is defined by its history of torturing inmates and even the excruciating murder of newborn infants. Bringing us to the case of Aisha Cleary. Aisha's then 18-year-old mother, Rihanna Cleary, was incarcerated at HMP Bronzefield during her pregnancy in 2019. On the 26th of September, Rihanna began to suffer extreme pain, leading her to call for help. The prison custody officer who responded to her first call, Mark Johnson, later asserted she had been abusive, that is to say she swore whilst demanding to see a nurse due to the extreme pain she was suffering. Not liking her tone, Johnson decided to do nothing to help her in spite of knowing that Rihanna was heavily pregnant. All subsequent calls were ignored, and the officer on patrol did nothing to intervene when he saw Rihanna on her hands and knees in her cell, screaming in agony. 18-year-old Rihanna was forced to give birth completely alone, having to chew through her newborn infant's umbilical cord before watching Aisha die a slow and painful death in her arms. The investigation wrapped up in July of 2023, less than 1 year before Ethisphere gave Sodexo the award, with the investigation uncovering extreme, quote-unquote, systemic failings by the agencies responsible for the care of this vulnerable 18-year-old and her newborn infant. This was a case which shook the world in just how inhuman it was, igniting rage across many groups. That is the institution gender-critical fascists are defending, a corporation known for the torture of women and murder of babies. To be clear, I'm not saying that it would be any more acceptable to torture men and or non-binary people. I bring this up since their justification for demonizing trans women and stripping trans men of all bodily autonomy to treat them like sexual slaves is the mantra of protecting women and children. Make no mistake, this isn't a means to an end. It's the end itself. Gender-critical fascists are more than happy to ally with a murderous and infanticidal women's prison as long as they hurt just one trans person, because hurting trans people, including trans men, is the goal. What's truly horrific is that Bronzefield has been like this for a long time. A surprise inspection as far back as 2013 discovered that one woman had been kept in the prison's segregation unit in quote-unquote squalid conditions for 5 years, a fact that Francis Crook, chief executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform, quite rightfully identified as blatant quote-unquote torture. Yet nothing was done to improve things in 2013, just like nothing was done after the investigation into Aisha's murder concluded in 2023, and will likely not be done when the investigation into Toni's murder concludes after 2026. How long does the violence in the system have to go on for before people are willing to admit that this isn't a bug, it's a feature? That it's the prison system working exactly as intended, violence which disproportionately impacts at-risk people, including young women of colour and trans men. May God help you if you're a trans man of colour. Sodexo did, of course, promise that it'd do better, particularly with medical support after Aisha's murder, claiming that they'd ensure 24-hour healthcare. Yet they lied. They always do. As expressed in the View magazine article, Quote, "This so-called healthcare unit, run by the Central and North West London NHS Foundation Trust, is notorious for neglect, dirty conditions and dehumanising treatment across their 4 locations. Women in crisis have reported being held like animals in cages, ignored when they cry for help, and forced to resort to dirty protest to have their voices heard. There is no 24-hour healthcare provision at Bronzefield. Despite promises on Sodexo's website, there is no resident GP after 7 p.m. The prison healthcare system is understaffed and mismanaged. Clinical leads, Harriet Tizard and Dave Wilkinson, are under investigation by the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and the GP Dr. Amon Wellahay has been investigated by the General Medical Council for failures in providing appropriate care and misunderstanding what parity of healthcare really means, namely that prisoners should receive the same standard of care as they would in the community." End quote. Prisoners can't get up and go to the hospital. If you incarcerate someone, then you are 100% responsible for their basic needs, their goddamn human rights. This is no less of an atrocity than if Sodexo were refusing to give prisoners food. And whilst the system might be set on enabling Sodexo to murder more people, fully aided by gender-critical fascists, I'm proud to say that portions of the trans community are fighting back, that human rights groups such as Bash Back have taken up the call. Again, Bash Back was how I was first alerted to Toni's murder, leading me to find the View magazine article that formed the heart of this video. Getting the word out is important in fighting this. Sadly, the state is very much opposed to that. At the time I'm writing this, the View magazine article only has 540 views. If we can even double that with the views on this video, I'd consider that an achievement. But you know what? I think we can do better. I think we can get the news out to at least several thousand people. There's a reason the UK press have ignored this topic, and that's because it undermines the myth of British civility. It lays bare the cruelty in our systems, just how unjust the self-labelled justice system really is. It demonstrates a real-life example of doublespeak, reminiscent of that book everyone loves to talk about when it comes to authoritarianism. It erodes the flimsy foundation upon which the current neoliberal nightmare is built upon. And that is terrifying to the very monsters who built it. Since once the spell of civility is broken, well, people might stand up to do the right thing, and the government can't have that. We see this in the actions of Bash Back, who laid siege to the Sodexo officers at one point, making clear that just because they're a private company in the pocket of the government, that no, they're not untouchable. That Sodexo can and will be made to answer for their crimes against basic humanity. Actions which were followed up by a list of demands, not just to help save trans prisoners, but all prisoners made to suffer the unjust systems that are our prisons. And they're having an effect. Whilst the UK press has been actively ignoring Toni Asik's murder by the state, that hasn't prevented it from running headlines such as "Trans mobs plot to smash up the offices of Prime Minister and streeting." Even Rowling herself, leader of the UK gender-critical movement, promoted this narrative. This is, of course, part of a system designed to fabricate consent. It's the press presenting said community defence in a vacuum, ignoring the facts that Bash Back has only emerged as a direct response to more than a decade of government-sanctioned violence, not just in prisons, but in the general public as well. Violence such as the murder of trans youth, police brutality towards children protesting said murder, and attempts to remove all trans people from public life entirely, efforts at the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention and Human Security have officially acknowledged as, quote, evidence of genocidal intent and actions targeting trans and intersex communities, end quote. Because once said community defense is put back in its proper context, we see it as exactly what it is. A brave few making a last-ditch stand against a system infected with fascism. Trans people valiantly resisting, actually doing the things so many people like to say they would have done had they lived in Germany during the rise of the Nazis. Because, make no mistake, that's where we are. But the trans community is not alone in this fight. Another movement which has also taken to direct action against our fascist government and its hand in genocide are Palestine Action and Prisoners for Palestine, including the prisoners at HMP Bronzefield, along with Pentonville, Wormwood Scrubs, Peterborough, and New Hall prisons. As explained by Eli Kajini in an article published in December, 8 incarcerated members of Prisoners for Palestine have gone on hunger strike, making this the largest hunger strike in the UK since the 1981 Irish hunger strikes. What Prisoners for Palestine are protesting is the UK government's continued participation in the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people, as well as the mistreatment of those who have exercised their conscience in trying to save said Palestinians. Keeping in mind that the 8 people who went on hunger strike haven't been tried or found guilty of any crime, they've only been accused of having taken part in one of 2 direct action protests. And yet, in spite of no trial, many of them have already been imprisoned for more than a year. The demands of the hunger strikers are 1. End censorship of prison materials, so not silencing prisoners or dictating what materials they're allowed to own, including those showing solidarity with the Palestinian people. 2. Immediate bail. Pretty self-explanatory. 3. The right to fair trial, so a basic human right that they, again, have been denied, with many of them having been imprisoned for over a year without any trial, let alone a fair one. 4. Deprescribe Palestine Action, so dropping all terror-related charges and links imposed on those who have allegedly been involved with Palestine Action. And 5. Shut down Elbit Systems UK, which supplies 80% of weapons and equipment to the IDS land forces and most of Israel's combat drones. And yet, in spite of their humanitarian actions in trying to put an end to genocide and their entirely reasonable demands, Prisoners for Palestine have been demonized. As reported on by Eli, quote, they have been artificially, tactically, made to seem radical by the UK government's financial investments in the annihilation of Gaza, and political investments in designating anti-genocide activism as terrorism. They have also been artificially made radical by the unacceptable conditions in UK prisons and immigration detention centres, where cruel and Kafkaesque systems of power has left prisoners with few options to resist mistreatment. End quote. Sound familiar? It's precisely what the papers are currently doing with Bashback and trans people in general. Yet, that's not the only way the two are connected. 3 of those who went on hunger strike were held at Bronzefield, and 2 of them, Amu Gibb and John Sink, are both trans, just like Toni, though we don't know exactly how they identify. John ended the hunger strike on the 16th of December 2025 due to hospitalization after 41 days. Amu, meanwhile, ended their hunger strike on the 24th of December, again due to hospitalization after 50 days. Do go and check out Eli's article, as it expands on everything relating to Palestine, which I sadly do not have the time to cover. But there's a few specific excerpts from Eli's article that I'd like to read in light of Toni's death back in July, including the following, quote, Amu described various specific anti-trans elements of the culture in Bronzefield, such as deliberate misgendering being used as punishment, invasive pat-downs from female guards being prioritized over less invasive scans from male guards, and transness being both delegitimized and weaponized to endorse further scrutiny of pro-Palestinian prisoners. Amu also said that an equality and diversity staffer alleged that their transness was a pretense, one created in order to spend more time with another defendant. End quote. Once again, echoing testimonies by the prisoners who knew Toni and what Toni had told his dad. This is months after Toni's death, yet Sodexo are still torturing trans prisoners. Yet things somehow managed to get worse, with Eli going on to write that quote. Amu also said in a voice note that they had been locked in their cell for hugging John on the day Toni Asik died, that basic care is punished by prisons when it goes beyond very strict bounds. End quote. That is monstrous. My editor Levi's response to that was to cry out, Jesus fucking Christ! They'll say prisons are about rehabilitation only to fucking punish basic humanity. Which, yeah, is a good fucking point. Only I then had to let Levi know that these people hadn't even faced trial, meaning that they're legally still innocent. Not that torture would be acceptable if they were found guilty, but it shows how normalized said violence is, and it also shows us that we're all potential targets. This is the UK injustice system systematically targeting community support surrounding the state-sanctioned murder of a member of that very same community. In my mind, this is the psychological equivalent of launching a second strike to kill aid workers rushing to save victims of the first strike. This is deliberate, cold, and calculated. Thankfully, there is solidarity among prisoners within Bronzefield, with the article expressing that, quote, yet amid this structure that seeks to eradicate care, the most care prisoners experience inside is from each other, with Amul stating, the prisoners here are so wonderful. Everyone's checking in on me, making sure I have hot water, coming to socialize with me in my cell, when I'm more of a shadowy version of myself, lending me clothes to keep warm. End quote. Showing us that, for all the bullshit spread by transphobes and fascists about vulnerable cis women, which includes prisoners, by the way, since the imprisoned are a marginalized class, whether they have been tried or not, supposedly being anti-trans, it is those very same women supporting our trans siblings on the inside. Just like the fact that 2 of the 8 people on hunger strike being trans completely rips apart the Zionist narrative that Israel, which massacres countless LGBT+ Palestinians, blackmails them, and refuses to accept LGBT+ people in general as equals, is somehow fighting on behalf of the queer community. It is not, and the LGBT+ community sees said genocidal leech for what it is. Palestinians are not our enemy, a fact I've gone into detail on in the past. Our enemy is fascism, including that at the head of the UK and US government, and yes, their puppet state in the Middle East, Israel. Which is why, as Eli noted, the UK press are so hell-bent on hiding the trans identity of both John and Amu, with the only hint I've seen of this being a BBC article dropping Amu's dead name. Again, just doubling down on the violence. This is why Eli goes on to conclude that, quote, the fight for trans liberation is akin to the fight for Palestinian liberation, as Trans Direct Action protest group Bash Back has emphasized in their statement of collaboration with Prisoners for Palestine. End quote. Bringing us full circle to Bash Back, who, in the statement linked by Eli, declared that, quote, as direct actionists ourselves, We are so proud to have comrades in Prisoners for Palestine to stand defiant against Sodexo and the draconian weaponization of anti-terror legislation designed to deter resistance. To Yasmin Cooper, security manager for Sodexo Justice Services, responsible for the use of anti-terror powers against P4P prisoners and ultimately responsible for the conditions that killed Toni, we will say this as bluntly as possible. You are an enemy of humanity. You are an enemy of justice. You are a murderer and a kidnapper doing the work for a genocidal state, and we will not rest until you face justice for what you have done to our prisoners, to Toni, to the absurd number of captives in your overcrowded jails. I hope you sleep well at night, because we will not rest until justice is felt, our trans community is liberated, our prisoners are freed, and a sun rises over a free Palestine. In solidarity and rage forever, until all are free. End quote. Before going on to add that quote, this is one struggle, one fight. They are now at risk of death. Our hearts burn as the actionists starve. We must act to save them, to oppose the state that has made us all victims. End quote. Because even as we fight off our own destruction at home, it is trans people, especially trans masked folk in this particular instance, who have the strength and integrity to stand against the genocide of the Palestinian people under US and European occupation. Because this is one struggle and we are stronger together, as one fist raised high. So thank you to everyone involved in Prisoners for Palestine, Palestine Action, and Bash Back. Thank you for doing what so few have the courage to do, and I hope that the courage by this trans person, exiled to India, can be a service to that, however small. We can all find a way to do our part. I originally wanted to say sorry that it took me so long to finish this video. It's such a heavy topic that I had 2 separate breakdowns as a result of my research, one in August and one in October. This video has had a massively negative impact on my mental health, and I will be slowing down to cover smaller news stories and topics, just to give myself time to heal before the next big project. But the fact is, part of me is sort of glad that I took this long, as the hearing for Toni's murder is in February. So I'd like to renew interest in that as much as possible, so that when the state inevitably tries to bury this, there's enough people watching to defend the rage that will follow. So please, share the articles by The View magazine, Eli, and this video if you found it to be helpful. Take elements presented here and make your own stuff. It doesn't have to be as expansive as this piece. It could be a single post on something as narrow as Amu and John being punished for hugging one another after Sodexo murdered Toni on behalf of the state. Make noise on this. Do not let the state bury this. You can even start by posting something down in the comments. Vent your thoughts on Toni's murder. Discuss the hunger strikes. Offer words of support for those in need. Do whatever you can, wherever you can, because that's how we grow our support and win this together. I'd just like to say a special thanks to Levi for helping me out on this video. I do try my best on transmask issues, but sadly, even I have a lot to learn or unlearn due to transmask erasure. So I'm incredibly grateful for his heavy editing on portions of this script. And if you appreciate what we do here as a group and want to help keep us running, please consider becoming one of the wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Flynn, Loombat, Bo Ayer, Deborah Goldsmith, Higgins the Seagull, Jackie Sins, Mix Alba, and Peter Cole. Take care now.